In the remote theater of the Pacific, during one of the most relentless campaigns of World War II, American forces faced a threat that seemed impenetrable: the Japanese Hornet's Nest on the island of Bougainville. This defensive bastion was not a simple series of trenches and improvised fortifications. It was a complex system of meticulously constructed bunkers, reinforced with materials capable of withstanding the heaviest artillery, skillfully camouflaged to evade aerial surveillance, and designed with crossfire fields that turned any enemy advance into a death sentence. Every attempt to penetrate that underground network resulted in merciless massacres. Every meter gained cost dozens of lives. The need for a solution was urgent. In response to the growing sophistication and ferocity of Japanese defenses, American forces began to develop and implement a series of systematic and increasingly refined methods to combat these threats. The brutal fate of Japanese soldiers at the hands of the flamethrower tank American troops required an instrument capable of advancing under constant fire, resisting impacts from light weapons, and at the same time expelling the enemy from their fortified hideouts. The answer emerged on January 30th, 1944, when 5 Stuart light tanks, modified with a brutally innovative weapon, advanced toward the heart of the Hornet's Nest. Those vehicles did not fire bullets or common projectiles. What they carried inside was a force as devastating as it was uncontrollable. Liquid fire, launched with lethal precision, converted into a deadly trap for both those who hid and those who manipulated it. The United States had entered the global conflict late, not for lack of industrial power or will, but for a persistent desire to avoid another catastrophe like World War I. However, when it was finally dragged into the conflict, it discovered that it was at a technological disadvantage compared to its enemies, especially regarding one of the most feared weapons of the modern battlefield, the flamethrower. Germany and Japan had already deployed rudimentary and advanced versions of this infernal weapon. Inspired by reports of fierce combat in the Pacific jungles, the American Army rushed to develop its own model, and thus the M1 flamethrower was born in 1941. Compact, portable, and designed to dislodge entrenched enemies, the M1 consisted of 2 fuel tanks tied to the operator's back, a compressed nitrogen cylinder for pressurization, and an ignition rod that projected a tongue of liquid fire at a distance of up to 20 yards. But theory soon faced the brutal reality of combat. In the humid, dense, and hostile jungles of the Pacific, the M1 proved to be profoundly unstable. Ignition, dependent on an electric spark or pilot flame, frequently failed under rain, wind, or humidity. Operators improvised with hand lighters, knowing that any error could be fatal. And if mechanical failures weren't enough, the weight of the equipment, more than 27 kilos, made the operator move slowly and be easily identifiable. Soldiers carrying flamethrowers became priority targets for the Japanese enemy, often being shot down before they could even enter combat. Fuel leaks or ignition failures could cause the soldier to catch fire before firing a single burst. Despite these horrors, the weapon's potential was undeniable. It could slip through every crack of a bunker, adhere to walls, fill every corner with smoke and fire. It was literally bottled hell. It was then, in mid-1943, that an unexpected idea emerged, born from pragmatism in the training field. On the island of New Caledonia, while training troops in flamethrower use, an officer from the 754th Tank Battalion observed with attention the difficulties of infantry operators. What he proposed was a solution as desperate as it was brilliant: mount a flamethrower inside the turret of an M3A1 Stuart light tank and fire it through the gun ports designed for secondary weapons. Although official documents do not reveal with certainty the officer's name, multiple testimonies attribute the idea to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, battalion commander. It was a rudimentary, improvised, and dangerous solution, but it had tactical logic. A tank could close distance with enemy positions while protecting its crew from small arms fire, allowing the flamethrower to operate with a degree of safety that infantry would never have. However, the practical implementation of the idea quickly revealed its weaknesses. Fuel pressure, limited flamethrower orientation from inside the turret, and the risk of accidental ignition represented threats to both the enemy and the crew itself. Despite the challenges, what began as a desperate improvisation marked a turning point. From these initial tests would be born the specialized flamethrower tank, a lethal combination of armor and fire, which would prove key in the brutal Pacific campaigns. The M1 alone was terrifying, but coupled to the body of an armored beast, it became a symbol of the absolute ferocity with which that war was fought. The interior of the M3A1 Stuart light tank was at best oppressive. Its reduced space barely sufficed to house a crew of 2 men. Attempting to introduce a full-size flamethrower into that same compartment bordered on the impossible. However, the tactical urgency of the moment left no room for skepticism. Experience gained in recent combat, especially during the bloody Battle of New Georgia in July 1943, had highlighted a pressing need. American forces required an armored solution that could counter Japanese iron defenses, deeply entrenched, resistant to artillery, and practically immune to air attacks. An weapon was needed that could break the line, devastate fortifications, and above all, protect those who operated it. It was on the island of New Caledonia, near Noumea, where American military engineers began experimenting with a bold solution. They took the M1A1 flamethrower, carefully dismantled it, shortened the barrel, redesigned the internal components, and reconfigured the fuel tanks so they would fit inside the Stuart's limited space. 2 5-gallon gasoline cans were strategically installed, one below the young gunner's seat and the other replacing the ammunition depot. The flamethrower nozzle was adapted to fire from the ball mount previously intended for the caliber .30 machine gun. It was an improvised design of artisanal execution, but with devastating potential. In October 1943, these modified prototypes were transferred to the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion for evaluation. A tense and meticulous demonstration was organized near Noumea, attended by high commands from the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Everyone understood the importance of the moment. The amphibious operation in Bougainville was scheduled for November 1st, and these flamethrower tanks were considered key pieces in breaking Japanese defenses. However, logistics and mechanics did not respond to the pace of war. When the first American wave landed on the shores of Bougainville, the flamethrower tanks were not yet operational. It was only in January 1944, during the Army's effort to expand the initial beachhead, that these weapons finally made their combat debut. The 754th Tank Battalion, a unit that had been deployed in the Pacific since the first months of 1942, had evolved profoundly. What began as a light tank formation had transformed into an aggressive and feared armored force. Under the command of Major Reino Lehtinen, the unit arrived in Bougainville with a new doctrine. It was not just about shooting, but about devastating. Their Stuart tanks, now armed with liquid fire, were the face of that new stage of war. On January 30th, 1944, this new weapon was put to the test in one of the deadliest terrains of the Pacific Theater, the so-called Hornet's Nest. Located southeast of Empress Augusta Bay, the perimeter was defended by a dense network of log bunkers and underground fortifications, sustained by units of the 2nd Battalion of the 4th South Seas Garrison. These positions, which extended from the east shore of the Torokina River to the vicinity of Mavavia village, represented a direct threat to American control over the coast. The first assaults by the 132nd Infantry Regiment failed before tenacious enemy resistance. Conventional weapons proved ineffective. Even portable flamethrowers, while useful at short distances, fatally exposed their operators to Japanese crossfire. Faced with this critical situation, General John Hodge, commander of the American division, ordered the deployment of elements from the 754th Tank Battalion, including the Stuart tanks converted to flamethrower tanks. The offensive began at 7:45 in the morning with a smoke mortar bombardment, followed by fire from 81mm mortars and intense artillery discharge. Half an hour later, at 8:30, Company C of the 132nd Infantry Regiment began its advancing behind the tanks in skirmish lines with demolition teams ready to act behind them. What followed was a chaotic scene of fire, smoke, and steel. Shortly after 9 a.m., tragedy struck from within. A poorly calculated Allied artillery salvo impacted directly on one of the lead tanks. The Stuart was instantly engulfed in flames. Staff Sergeant J. Hall, vehicle commander, died instantly. 2 more crew members were seriously wounded. Corporal Joe Simon, in an act of desperate bravery, managed to escape the burning hell, but was shot down while trying to rescue his companions. His sacrifice earned him, posthumously, the Silver Star. Meanwhile, Japanese fire intensified with fury. Sergeant Jesse Drowley, positioned nearby with Company B, witnessed the scene. Without hesitation, he abandoned his cover and ran under a rain of bullets toward the wounded. With the din of combat deafening him and explosions shaking the ground, he managed to reach them and get them to safety. His heroic act became one of the most moving and brave moments of that infernal day. What was experienced that day in the Hornet's Nest was more than a battle. It was a collision between technological desperation, tactical improvisation, and the brutality of modern combat. The flamethrower, now mounted on tracks, not only transformed war in the Pacific Islands, but left an indelible mark on those who used it and those who faced it. Flamethrower tanks began to demonstrate without a doubt their lethal effectiveness on the Pacific battlefield. Their ability to lead frontal assaults and annihilate enemy fortifications that resisted conventional fire made them instruments of destruction as innovative as they were fearsome. Japanese defensive structures, especially reinforced log bunkers and caves hidden among dense tropical vegetation, offered formidable resistance to light artillery and direct infantry attacks. But now, with the modified Stuarts armed with M1A1 flamethrowers, those positions could be eradicated in a matter of seconds. Liquid fire, penetrating openings, tunnels, and crevices consumed air and destroyed both structures and wills. However, even with the addition of additional steel plates intended to protect flamethrower operators, the tanks remained vulnerable. Dangers did not come solely from the enemy. The combustion system itself was volatile and treacherous. During the climax of the assault on the so-called Hornet's Nest, an M3A1 equipped with a flamethrower was engaged in a frontal attack against a Japanese bunker that had managed to immobilize a complete company of American infantry with sustained fire. The flamethrower operator managed to position himself adequately and sprayed the bunker with a long burst of gelatinous fuel. But the ignition mechanism failed. The fuel soaked the enemy structure but did not ignite. The tension was instantaneous. He knew he would not have a second chance. In a desperate decision, but executed with heroic clarity, the flamethrower operator opened the tank's upper hatch and, under the buzz of enemy bullets that impacted centimeters from his body, threw a thermite grenade right over the spilled liquid. An instant later, a searing flash illuminated the landscape. The bunker was devoured by an infernal blaze that turned it into a burning pyre. The interior was transformed into a death trap. All the Japanese defenders who occupied it were incinerated in a matter of seconds. It was an act of absolute determination, a combination of ingenuity, valor, and sacrifice that exemplified the brutality of combat in the Pacific. The Japanese response was not long in coming. At 10:30 a.m., knowing that flamethrower tanks represented an existential threat to their defensive positions, the Japanese counterattacked. With mortar fire calibrated directly on the armored units and a rain of Molotov cocktails, they sought to neutralize the Stuarts at their weak point, their limited capacity for prolonged resistance, and the exposure of their crew to direct impacts. Second Lieutenant John White and Sergeant James Jarman lost their lives instantly when their tank was hit by an enemy projectile that detonated one of the internal fuel tanks. It was a terrifying explosion that marked the air with a mushroom of fire and black smoke, but the will to fight was not extinguished. Sergeant Jesse Drowley, witness to what had happened and already become an almost mythical figure among his companions, responded with an almost superhuman force. While combat intensified and the American line began to fragment, Drowley identified a hidden machine gun nest that, incredibly, had managed to evade both tank attention and infantry platoons. This firing point was causing havoc, decimating reinforcements trying to advance. Without hesitation, Drowley ran across open field, crossing a hell of crossfire until reaching the nearest flamethrower tank. He climbed onto the armored vehicle, struck the turret with his rifle butt, and through shouts and signals indicated the enemy position to the crew. The tank fired but missed the target. Visibility from inside was scarce. The confusion of the reigning combat did not facilitate precision. It was then that Drowley made a decision as reckless as it was essential. He obtained a submachine gun equipped with tracer ammunition, and while bullets whistled around him and smoke partially blinded him, fired a controlled sequence of bursts toward the machine gun nest. The incandescent lines of tracer bullets served as a guide for the tank crew. At that same instant, Drowley was hit in the face and chest. He fell to his knees, bleeding profusely, half-blind. But he did not retreat. Despite his wounds, he refused to be evacuated until ensuring that the enemy position had been completely neutralized. Only when the sea of fire consumed the Japanese trench did he accept, staggering, his companions' help. Subsequently, Drowley was decorated with the Medal of Honor in a solemn ceremony headed personally by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His story, testimony of individual valor in the face of annihilation, became a symbol of a war where daily heroism was the only barrier between life and death. By the early afternoon hours, flamethrower tanks were forced to temporarily withdraw. Their systems required refueling and repressurization, since each fire burst lasted barely 20 seconds, and their supply lines were long and vulnerable. At 1:30 p.m., 5 Stuarts with flamethrowers returned to the front, rejoining combat with renewed intensity. In close coordination with infantry, they initiated a methodical process of eradicating Japanese fortifications. By the end of the day, they had incinerated and destroyed a total of 28 bunkers. Of these, 14 were attributed directly to flamethrower tanks, the rest to joint action of portable flamethrowers, rifle fire, and mortars. The Battle of the Hornet's Nest became, in retrospect, a decisive turning point in the evolution of armored warfare in the Pacific theater. For the first time, the operational effectiveness of armor armed with liquid fire as a tool to break static and deeply fortified lines was demonstrated. What began as an improvised solution in Bougainville, born from desperation and necessity, crystallized into a formal doctrine. By mid-1944, purpose-built flamethrower tanks, like the feared Satan, an adaptation of the M4 Sherman, began to be incorporated into American arsenals just in time for campaigns in Saipan, Guam, and other fortress islands of the Central Pacific. Bougainville, with its closed jungles and invisible enemies, had been the brutal laboratory of this tactical evolution. Through fire and steel, the fire tank and infantry team not only earned its place in American strategy, but rewrote the rules of armored assault in the jungle. Pacific Theater, American flamethrower tanks. Since antiquity, fire has been a tool as primitive as it is terrifying in the art of war. Its capacity to devastate not only physical structures but also enemy morale has been recognized by generations of combatants. However, it was not until the industrial horrors of World War I that the modern flamethrower emerged as a specialized combat instrument. Even so, within the United States Army, its acceptance was lukewarm. Military high command showed skepticism about its real utility on the battlefield. For many officers, the flamethrower was a dangerous rarity, an artifact of dubious effectiveness whose operation implied extreme risks for the operator himself. As a result, for years, this weapon remained marginalized, underestimated both in its destructive capacity and tactical potential. Much of the impulse that would end up reversing this perception did not come from Washington offices or military academies, but from the very mud, sweat, and blood of the Pacific theater of operations. It was in the humid jungles and scorching beaches of the South Pacific where American soldiers faced face-to-face with an entrenched, invisible enemy absolutely determined to resist to the last man. In 1943, pushed by desperate need to break deeply entrenched Japanese defenses and supported by improvised initiatives from units in the field, engineers began adapting portable flamethrowers to the interior of light tanks, like the M3 Stuart. These conversions, though primitive, marked the beginning of a new era in armored warfare. When, in 1944, the axis of combat shifted from South Pacific jungles to the coral and volcanic islands of the Central Pacific, territories like Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, or Peleliu, combat became even more brutal and claustrophobic. Japanese strategy evolved. It was no longer about simple defense lines on the ground, but true underground complexes excavated in volcanic rock with interconnected caves, escape tunnels, and fortified firing positions capable of resisting days of bombardment. In that context, tank-mounted flamethrowers ceased to be a tactical rarity to become an urgent necessity, one of the few weapons capable of clearing cavities and destroying enemy garrisons without risking an entire infantry company. In marked contrast, the European theater did not offer the same conditions for deploying flamethrower tanks. The mobile nature of war in Western Europe, with constantly advancing fronts, wide plains, and bombed but not rock-fortified cities, made these systems play a marginal role compared to the Pacific's specific needs. The doctrinal rigidity of the American Army also contributed to this difference. While Marines in the Pacific experimented with almost desperate pragmatism, European commands adhered more strictly to the classic mechanized model of infantry and armor. During World War II, the American Army ended up developing three main variants of tank flamethrowers. The most impactful, and undoubtedly the most effective, was the version that replaced the tank's main armament with a long-range flamethrower. Capable of projecting a tongue of fire dozens of meters away, it was ideal for attacking fortifications and cave entrances from safe positions. Auxiliary versions were also manufactured, which replaced bow machine guns or were integrated into roof periscopes, although their range and fire volume were limited. Despite their number, these secondary systems could not compare in power with their main armament counterparts. Curiously, the most remote antecedent of American flamethrower tanks dates back to 1917. During World War I, Major Harold Adams of the Corps of Engineers devised a long-range flamethrower based on a steam boiler capable of propelling a mixture of atomized fuel oil to a distance of more than 80 meters. His vision culminated in the design of an experimental vehicle, a steam tank inspired by British rhomboid models, equipped with 500 horsepower steam engines and a Mark I flame projector at the front. On the sides, reinforced railings housed caliber .30 machine guns. In September 1918, the strange machine was sent to France and subjected to a private demonstration before General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, in the surroundings of Chaumont. However, the project was harshly criticized by Colonel Amos Fries. then chemical officer of the AEF, who sentenced with determination, "The use of liquid fire or flamethrowers is rapidly becoming obsolete in all armies. The manpower, expense, and danger to our own troops using these devices are so great that they make other means of attack preferable in practically all cases." Freeze not only dismissed the innovation, but exercised decisive influence in its cancellation. Shortly after, the November 1918 armistice ended up burying the project. The post-war brought years of abandonment. Flamethrower research passed to the new Chemical Warfare Service, CWS, ironically led in its early years by Amos Fries himself, whose hostility toward this weapon conditioned an entire generation of developments. A subsequent CWS study on the lessons of the Great War catalogued the flamethrower as one of the conflict's greatest technological failures, and for almost 2 decades, no substantial resources were allocated to its improvement. It was not until 1940, on the eve of a new global war, that the spectre of the flamethrower began to resurface. Driven by reports on the use of flamethrower tanks by Italian forces in Abyssinia and German panzer divisions in Poland, the American Army approved, on May 28th of that year, the development of a prototype designated mechanized transport flamethrower. With limited resources, the CWS worked from Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, adapting the E1 flamethrower to an obsolete Cunningham T 2 4.2-inch mortar carrier due to the lack of availability of modern tanks. The first tests, in September 1940, exposed multiple mechanical and operational deficiencies. However, after a series of modifications, the model was presented to the newly created Armored Force on October 16th. Their verdict was clear: any flamethrower must be installed on a medium combat tank and not on an obsolete vehicle. The Cunningham project was discarded. But what had begun as a relegated idea slowly took shape. The urgency of conflict in the Pacific, pressure from frontline units, and the brutality of Japanese resistance forced a conceptual transformation. What was once an experimental rarity became, through fire, steel, and sacrifice, an essential piece of modern warfare in the Pacific. Since none of the new M3 medium tanks were available for experiments, the CWS received an older M2 medium tank at Fort Knox. The mechanized flamethrower E2 consisted of a flamethrower gun in the turret, which replaced the usual 37mm gun, a pair of 60-gallon fuel cells on the tank floor, and 3 compressed nitrogen tanks on the rear deck. Initial tests at Fort Knox were discouraging due to numerous mechanical problems, and formal tests for the Armored Testing Board in September 1941 were a failure due to poor system reliability. The board refused to support acceptance of the weapon for use in armored forces. In early 1942, an ad hoc review committee concluded that the mechanized flamethrower was problematic and that only the portable flamethrower was necessary for Army use. The CWS was limited in its ability to develop mechanized flamethrowers by Army Ground Forces policy, which did not authorize development programs unless they were based on combat need, an explicit requirement from the Combat Corps that would use the weapon. Since the CWS was not authorized to deploy units with flamethrowers, it required armored force support. While the armored force did not stop CWS development of mechanized flamethrowers, their skepticism about the value of such weapons undermined early CWS efforts. Studies were conducted on the possibility of using a tank-mounted flamethrower to fight other tanks, but this idea was rejected due to the weapon's short range and the tank's protection against flame attacks. The next mechanized flamethrower, the E3, was mounted on the M3 medium tank. To avoid the need for a set of compressed air tanks to propel the fuel, the E-3 system used a rotary pump powered by the tank's engine. Tests of the E-3 in summer 1942 were discouraging because the pump required the driver to operate the engine in a very narrow power range, and the pump rotor blades broke down the thickened fuel. After poor results in armored force board tests, the E-3 was redesigned to use pressurized air. But by then, the armored force was increasingly exasperated with the idea of a flamethrower as a tank's main armament. However, it was willing to support development of a smaller flamethrower that could be used as auxiliary armament instead of the usual bow machine gun. Although the CWS was the main flamethrower development agency of the U.S. Army, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, had a broader mandate to study technology that could be used by the War Department. The OSRD's National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, had begun examining technical advances in Great Britain as part of its function of sponsoring technological innovation. The British Petroleum Warfare Board was conducting a major flamethrower program, and the NDRC received information about their advances. The NDRC was able to continue with flamethrower development despite AGF skepticism, and their participation proved invaluable as it maintained broad contacts with industrial companies in the petroleum sector, such as Shell Development Company and Standard Oil Development Company, as well as engineering departments of major universities like MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1942, the NDRC sponsored a series of experimental flamethrowers, designated Models A, B, C, and D, inspired by the British-Canadian Ronson model. In addition to work on actual weapons, the NDRC funded crucial work on supporting technologies, such as thickened fuel and ignition techniques. The first CWS portable flamethrower of war in late 1941. Its erratic ignition, short thickened fuel was followed to provide remained. The first M-Area SPA in August 1st in combat for the B-10. The first CWS flamethrower to be accepted for U.S. Army use was the M1 portable flamethrower that entered production shortly before the outbreak of war in late 1941. It was an extremely problematic weapon, suffering from erratic ignition, short battery life, and poor durability in humid conditions. It was followed by the improved M1A1 portable flamethrower that used thickened fuel to provide better range. However, many reliability problems persisted. The first M1A1 flamethrowers began arriving in the South Pacific area in August 1942. The portable flamethrower was successfully used in combat for the first time during the Guadalcanal campaign on January 15, 1943, by U.S. Army and Marine troops. During subsequent use of flamethrowers in the Solomon Islands, as well as in other parts of the Southwest Pacific area, such as Buna and New Georgia, it quickly became evident that those using them were very vulnerable to Japanese small arms fire due to the weight of the equipment and the visibility of the location once ignited. An alternative was to mount these flamethrowers on tanks to safely approach Japanese bunkers at the short distances necessary for the flamethrower to be effective. Not having mechanized flamethrowers available through official channels, South Pacific units began to improvise. The first known attempt was made in New Caledonia in late summer 1943, when the 754th Tank Battalion attempted to fire portable flamethrowers from the gun ports of their M3A1 light tanks. This was not practical due to the reduced space inside the light tank turret. Fighting in New Georgia against tenacious Japanese bunker defenses drove development of a more satisfactory mount, and in August 1943, the U.S. Army's 14th Corps initiated a project to adapt the M1A1 flamethrower to the bow machine gun mount of the M3A1 light tank. Demonstrations in New Caledonia in October 1943 led to a broad but dispersed effort by many Army and Marine tank battalions based on these examples. The first combat use of American flamethrower tanks took place during fighting in Bougainville in the northern Solomon Islands. On January 30th, 1944, Company A, 754th Tank Battalion, supported Company C, 132nd Infantry as part of the American Division's effort to push their perimeter over the east side of the Torokina River and through a line of Japanese bunkers. Some of the M3A1 light tanks were equipped with bow flamethrowers, and these were used with some success in reducing several Japanese bunkers. A similar effort by the 1st Marine Tank Battalion on the Arawa Peninsula in New Britain in February 1944 was less successful because the flamethrower igniters failed. A crewman finally ignited the stream by throwing a thermite grenade in front of the tank. In preparation for the Kwajalein landing in February 1944, the CWS section of the 7th Army Division installed M1A1 flamethrowers on M5A1 light tanks and LVT amphibious tractors, incorporating an enlarged fuel tank provided from Hawaii. These weapons proved ineffective as their electrical systems flooded during landings. The main technical problem of improvised flamethrowers mounted on tanks was the poor reliability of the M1A1 ignition system. As a solution, an Army tank battalion drilled a hole in the glacis plate of the M3A1 light tank in front of the bow machine gun mount to install a modified flamethrower nozzle and then used tracer fire to ignite the fuel. In May 1944, other Army units in New Caledonia developed a method to mount the M1A1 alongside the caliber dot. 30 machine guns so that the fuel flow could be ignited with tracers. The CWS informed local commanders that standardized auxiliary flamethrowers for tanks would soon be available in the United States, so the 6th Army issued a directive in July 1944 to suspend use of improvised flamethrowers. The mechanized flamethrower. E4-5 reports from the Pacific Theater of Operations made it clear that an auxiliary mechanized flamethrower was needed as soon as possible. On October 11, 1943, a conference of Army's main commands was held at the Army War School, and as a result, on October 20th, the Army Service Forces authorized CWS to develop an auxiliary mechanized flamethrower designated E4-5. With this weapon, a new designation pattern for CWS flamethrowers was initiated. The E4-5 designation indicated a flamethrower that used the E4 fuel tank assembly coupled to the E5 flamethrower gun. In case of using two fuel tanks, the designation was expanded. For example, the E4R2-E4R3-E5R1 consisted of E4R2 and E4R3 fuel tanks coupled to an E5R1 flamethrower gun. The AGF requirement for the E4-5 established the need for an auxiliary flamethrower with a range of 55 to 64 meters when using thickened fuel, with a discharge rate of at least half a gallon of fuel per second. The E4-5 was based on the new M2 portable flamethrower, but used a much larger fuel tank and was designed to fit in the standard machine gun ball mount of the M4 medium tank. The first production contract was signed on December 16, 1943, for 82 units, a total that was continuously increased until early 1944. The first production specimens were sent to Fort Knox for testing in February 1944, and the Armored Force Board issued its report on March 10, 1944. The E-4-5 was considered overall satisfactory, although it presented numerous technical problems. For example, the airbase doubted mounting the weapon at the Bow machine gun station and recommended that CWS develop an auxiliary flamethrower that could be mounted on the hatch periscope mount so that the Bow machine gun could continue to be used. In view of the urgent need for mechanized flamethrowers in the Pacific, the AGF dismissed the AFB's decision and authorized limited acquisition of the E-4-5 until a more satisfactory design emerged. The E-4-5 system underwent continuous improvement during production in 1944, with modifications such as increasing M20 acceptance, the improved E-5R1 flamethrower, and adding a second fuel unit to increase capacity from 25 to 50 gallons. Meanwhile, a similar system for light tanks, the E-5-5, which used a smaller 10-gallon fuel unit, was also accepted for limited acquisition in March 1944. The Hawaiian Hell. Delays in manufacturing a satisfactory tank flamethrower frustrated field commanders in the Pacific, who sought an immediate solution to the growing problem of Japanese defenses against bunkers. Lieutenant General Robert Richardson, commander of the Central Pacific area, urgently requested tank flamethrowers from the War Department and was promised 40 of the new E-4-5 auxiliary flamethrowers for the start of the summer campaign in the Marianas. They did not arrive on time. Lieutenant General Holland Howling Mad Smith, commander of the V Amphibious Corps assigned to the Marianas mission, initiated a flamethrower program based on Tarawa reports about the value of flamethrowers for confronting Japanese fortifications. The 5th Amphibious Corps knew about the Canadian Ronson flamethrower and requested shipment of a supply as soon as possible. The Canadians were delighted to collaborate, and 20 Ronsons arrived in Hawaii in January 1944, along with a small Canadian team headed by First Lieutenant Trickey. They were sent to the Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service in Oahu under the command of Colonel George Unmacht. This small office, in collaboration with the 43rd CWS Chemical Laboratory Company, would become the most productive and innovative flamethrower tank development center for Americans during the war. Unmacht, in collaboration with Marine personnel, installed the Ronson in an LVT-2 amphibious fuel tank with double tank set. Although this was successfully demonstrated to V Amphibious Corps officers in February 1944, there was widespread opinion that the vehicle was too vulnerable to small arms fire. Since no medium tanks were available, Unmacht developed a mount on the M3A1 light tank called Satan. This was demonstrated to senior V Amphibious Corps officers on April 15, 1944. Howling Mad Smith was so impressed with the demonstration that he ordered conversion of 24 light tanks into Satan flamethrowers in time for the Saipan landing. Conversions were performed at Pearl Harbor by civilian and military personnel and completed on May 17, 1944. The Satan was a modified version of the Canadian Ronson Fuel Mark IV. The tank carried 670 liters of fuel and used gas pressure to propel the flame to a range of 74 meters for thickened fuel and 55 meters for non-thickened fuel. The improvised mount limited turret traverse. The tank's internal volume was seriously compromised by the mount, but there was widespread recognition that the Satan was far superior to previous improvisations. The 24 tanks were divided between the 2nd and 4th. Marine Tank Battalions. Each Marine regiment in Saipan had the support of a tank company composed of 18 M4 medium tanks. reinforced by a Satan flamethrower platoon with 4 M3A1 Satan flamethrower tanks and 2 M5A1 light tanks. The M5A1 light tanks served as escorts to the Satan tanks to deter Japanese infantry assaults. After the Saipan landing on June 15, 1944, the Satans were employed against various targets. They proved especially useful against Japanese cave defenses and were extensively employed in cleanup operations at the end of the campaign. On July 24th, when the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on neighboring Tinian, the two Satan companies followed them. The terrain in Tinian was more favorable for tank operations than in Saipan, and the Satans were extensively used in combat. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion lost 1 Satan to a mine, and many other tanks suffered mechanical breakdowns due to intensive use. Units were forced to cannibalize parts to keep the Satan force operational. The Marines gradually began developing specialized tactics to deal with Japanese cave defenses. The attack usually began with an M4A2 medium tank opening the cave entrance with high explosive fire, followed by a Satan attack to suppress any Japanese resistance. This was frequently followed by close assault teams equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Flamethrowers proved unusually effective against cave defenses, as the combustion of flames near the entrance created a lethal concentration of carbon monoxide that asphyxiated surviving Japanese troops in the caves. Post-attack inspections revealed that 4 out of 5 Japanese casualties from flamethrower attacks were caused by carbon monoxide asphyxiation. On average, flamethrower tanks consumed a 55-gallon barrel of fuel per day. During the Saipan combat, the 4th Marine Tank Battalion burned more than 36,000 gallons. Although flamethrower tanks had proven to be a useful addition to the Marine arsenal, there was no consensus on future needs. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion's after-action report criticized the use of flamethrowers as main armament for being too specialized and recommended that in the future a better solution would be an auxiliary flamethrower with adequate range and fuel capacity. On July 24th, the 3rd Amphibious Corps assaulted neighboring Guam. 6 M4A2 medium tanks from the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion were equipped with the newly arrived E4-5 auxiliary flamethrowers, and another 36 M1A1 portable flamethrowers were adapted for tank use. The E4-5 was first used in combat during the Battle of Asan Point on July 25th. The unit's after-action report concluded that the E4-5 is far superior to the M1A1 and the modified M1 for tank use, and the assignment of 8 flamethrowers per company of 15 tanks is adequate. A flamethrower larger than the E4-5 is not recommendable due to limited space in the tank and the need to remove armament. In November 1942, the NDRC awarded a contract to Standard Oil to design a high-capacity flamethrower designated Model Q. The Q stood for Quickie, and as its name indicated, the NDRC presumed that the Model Q would be simple to develop based on previous NDRC experimental flamethrowers. The first test specimen was mounted on a trailer and a demonstration was conducted in January 1943. This led to a second contract with Standard Oil to adapt the Model Q to the M5A1 light tank, which was subsequently designated as E7-7. After the Tarawa fighting in November 1943, the U.S. Navy began considering the advisability of mounting long-range flamethrowers on landing craft to attack Japanese bunkers along the beachhead during amphibious attacks. The NDRC presented the experimental Model Q to the Navy between December 1943 and January 1944, resulting in a contract with M.W. Kellogg Co. and Standard Oil for manufacturing 21 Mark I flamethrowers. These were designed as 3.2-ton modular units that could be loaded onto LCVP or LCM landing craft using a crane. The Mark I featured a substantial 200-gallon fuel tank, backed by a series of pressurized nitrogen tanks providing 2,000 psi, allowing it to fire at about 100 yards, 91 meters, with napalm-thickened fuel. 5 of the Mark I-ton flamethrowers arrived in Hawaii in May 1944, and Unmacht's team mounted one of them on an M3A5 medium tank with the Q gun installed instead of the usual 37mm gun. In June 1944, another Navy flamethrower team was sent to the 1st Marine Amphibious Tractor Battalion in Guadalcanal, which was preparing to land in Palau along with its host unit, the 1st Marine Division, in September 1944. Instead of mounting the Mark I on a landing craft, the Navy installed it on an LVT-4 amphibious transport vehicle on a wooden frame built in the rear cargo hold. The Mark I pallet could be transferred to another amphibious transport vehicle if vehicle repair was necessary. The Marine Flamethrower Unit had a total of 6 Mark I flamethrowers and 19 LVT-4 amphibious transport vehicles for the mission. The 1st Marine Tank Battalion also had a small number of E4-5 auxiliary flamethrowers mounted on their tanks. Most Marine officers were unaware of Navy Flamethrower Unit number. One which remained inactive for several days after the September 15, 1944 amphibious landing. In fact, the Mark I flamethrowers were only used intensively during the final stages of the Peleliu campaign. Japanese defenders withdrew to the steep cliffs inland, where numerous defensive caves had been created. The Mark I flamethrowers were employed for 61 days of combat, primarily to burn caves and other defenses. The unit's after-action report estimated that 100 caves had been burned, in addition to 25 bunkers and other defensive works, and about 40 areas had been cleared with flames to support Marine and Army operations. The Mark I proved to be a much more powerful and robust weapon than any previous American flamethrower, but the flamethrower proved to be a poor choice as transport. The flamethrowers were not designed for sustained ground operations and suffered numerous mechanical breakdowns. Navy Flamethrower Unit No. 1 rarely had more than 4 flamethrowers operational simultaneously. One of the most curious field adaptations of the Mark I took place during the fight for the Umobrogol pocket. Since armored vehicles could not get close enough to some Japanese defenses, engineers connected a 300-yard fire hose to the flamethrower unit and then increased pressure with additional pumps. This type of device was subsequently called an assault flamethrower. General Richardson learned of this tactic days later and requested that Unmacht's POACWS perfect this method of attack. As combat neared its end, the detachment finally withdrew on November 28, 1944. The remaining equipment was turned over to the U.S. Army's 323rd Infantry Regiment, which used it for several more days in cleanup operations. The Army's 154th Engineer Battalion created their own assault flamethrower, using a tank truck connected to hoses and pumps for these operations. Peleliu represented the most sustained use of American flamethrowers to date, largely due to changes in Japanese defensive tactics. During most of the war, the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, relied on a waterline defense doctrine, which emphasized the use of bunkers along the beach, followed by inland banzai counterattacks. However, Central Pacific fighting in 1943 at Tarawa and Kwajalein made it clear that such tactics were unsuccessful. New tactics emphasized creating deep defense lines that depended on extensive fortification through tunneling into coral and rock. Banzai counterattacks were discouraged. The U.S. Marine Corps and Army discovered that this type of fortification was very costly to overcome, and one of the few effective weapons was the flamethrower. As a result, flamethrower tactics became increasingly central to American assault tactics in the last year of the Pacific War. Philippines. The Sixth Army's operations in the Philippines saw very limited use of flamethrower tanks. During summer 1944, 24th Corps headquarters requested that Unmacht's POA-CWS mount a flamethrower on an LVT-A-1 amphibious tank, which used the same Ronson configuration as their previous Satan tanks. Additionally, 9 other Satan conversions were made on M3A1 light tanks. 24th Corps deployed their small flamethrower force in Leyte, Philippines in October 1944. Resistance near the landing site was less than in previous Pacific battles, and the LVT-A-1 with the Ronson was used to attack a single coconut log bunker. The M3A1 Satan flamethrowers were employed by the 20th Armored Group primarily in an improvised manner to help burn foliage that concealed Japanese defenses. The 603rd Tank Company had E-4-5 auxiliary flamethrowers when deployed to Leyte, but their use was scarce or non-existent. Army flamethrowers had very little impact on Leyte fighting, partly due to humid autumn conditions. By the time of January 1945 landings on neighboring Luzon, a larger flamethrower force had been created. Several E-4-5 auxiliary flamethrowers were delivered to U.S. Army tank battalions, including the 755 Tank Battalion, and also had limited use in urban fighting in Manila with the 603 Tank Company. The NDRC program to mount the Model Q flamethrower on the M5A1 light tank had resulted in construction of 4 E-77s in 1944. However, the U.S. Army was no longer interested in main armament flamethrowers on light tanks when they were ready, and development had shifted toward medium tanks. A flamethrower detachment composed of 4 E-77 tanks was sent to Luzon and assigned to I Corps during fighting in the Balit Pass area in April 1945, supporting the 25th Division. The E-77s were employed against various Japanese field defenses, and the flamethrower unit proved much more durable and reliable than most improvised designs previously employed on the Pacific Front. However, at this stage of the war, the M5A1 light tank had too light armor to resist new Japanese anti-tank weapons, such as the 47mm gun, and it was widely recognized that it would be better to mount a flamethrower of this type on a medium tank. Iwo Jima. After fighting in Peleliu, there was considerable concern about Japanese cave defenses in Iwo Jima, the next major objective of the U.S. Marine Corps. While the Mark I flamethrower had proven very effective in Peleliu, the LVT-4 Amtrak was far from ideal as transport. As a result, Fleet Marine Forces urgently requested General Richardson to authorize Unmacht's POA-CWS to build main armament flamethrowers on medium tanks for the upcoming landings. This program was already underway based on POA-CWS experiments with mounting the Mark I on an M3A5 medium tank. Unmacht concluded that the weapon would not fit, as designed, in the flatter hull of the M4 medium tank, and in that case there were not enough Mark I guns available. In contrast, there was a steady supply of Canadian Ronson flamethrowers and their parts. Meanwhile, Eigelhart, a civilian engineer from the POA Operational Research Section, devised an alternative flamethrower design that used gas pressure instead of springs in fuel valves. POA CWS built one of the Eigelhart flamethrowers along with a modified Ronson with Eigelhart valve improvements. 10th Army officers complained that the short fake tube used to enclose the flamethrower was unacceptable and must resemble the normal 75mm tube to prevent Japanese from identifying flamethrower tanks. Another version of the Ronson design was built using 75mm gun tubes, which became the basis for the POACW SH-1 flamethrower. This system included 1,040 liters of fuel in 4 tanks under the turret, propelled by compressed carbon dioxide. In 1945, a total of 176 of these periscope flamethrowers were manufactured in Hawaii, using various combinations of fuel groups and guns, including the E-4H1, among others. They were primarily intended for the 10th Army. The Marines were not satisfied with the location of these flamethrowers in the co-driver's hatch, for fear it would be vulnerable to Japanese magnetic mines. Before Iwo Jima, flamethrower tanks also presented the E4R2-5R1 auxiliary flamethrower to the Marines and Army. The Marines preferred the ignition system developed by POA-CWS for the periscope mount, so they began modifying the E4-5 with their improved features. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion had 24 E4-5 flamethrowers mounted on their tanks, in addition to the 4 POA-CW-SH-1 tanks, and the 5th Marine Tank Battalion also had a portion of their tanks equipped with auxiliary flamethrowers. Japanese defenses in Iwo Jima were based on a network of caves and bunkers built on the volcanic island. Flamethrowers were by far the most effective weapon against these defenses, and both portable and mechanized flamethrowers were the Marines' main weapon during the fierce battle that began on February 19, 1945. Flamethrower tanks were used in coordination with bulldozer tanks to facilitate access to Japanese defenses, and with regular artillery tanks to provide supporting fire and prevent close-range Japanese infantry attacks. The 5th Marine Tank Battalion's flamethrower tanks consumed 5,000 to 10,000 gallons of thickened fuel per day, and the main disadvantage was the lack of sufficient POA-CWSH-1 main armament flamethrower tanks. The arrival of the 3rd Marine Division as reinforcement did not help, as the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion lacked main armament flamethrower tanks and was limited to the new E4R2-5R1 auxiliary flamethrowers. The 5th Marine Tank Battalion's after-action report concluded that the flamethrower tank performed splendidly and consistently overcame resistance that no other weapon had managed to silence. The commander of the 28th Marine Regiment, who had been supported by the 5th Marine Tank Battalion, called flamethrower tanks the best weapon of the operation. The 9th Marine Regiment described the mechanized flamethrower as the most powerful weapon at their disposal. Their after-action report attributed their effectiveness to the flamejet's ability to penetrate small openings in pillboxes and caves, covering all contours and folds with fire, defenses that had resisted constant artillery, naval fire and close-range fire from 75mm tanks succumbed to the H-1 flamethrower tanks. The V Corps commander identified the mechanized flamethrower as the only effective means to attack numerous fortified pillboxes, bunkers, and caves. Unlike the POACWS H1, the E4-5 auxiliary flamethrower was not very popular. The short range of the small flamethrower, E4-5, made it practically useless. The E4-5 flamethrower has very little range, takes too long to refuel, and does not have sufficient firing duration. Tanks equipped with auxiliary flamethrowers gained a reputation for being death traps, as some marine tankers considered that flamethrower fuel fires amplified damage from mines and artillery. The 5th Marine Tank Battalion recommended that, in the future, a flamethrower tank section of at least 9 flamethrower tanks be assigned to each battalion. The battalion suggested that the E4-5 be eliminated, or, if an auxiliary flamethrower was maintained as standard equipment, that it be modified to allow retention of the bow machine gun. Operation Iceberg, Okinawa. In August 1944, Unmacht's POACWS conducted a demonstration of available flamethrowers to 10th Army officers with a view to the next major amphibious landing in Okinawa. Given the resounding success of flamethrower tanks during the Iwo Jima battles, flamethrower tank workshops in Hawaii were ordered to build as many main armament flamethrowers as possible. By late August 1944, the 10th Army estimated that 223 would be needed, but this figure exceeded the reserve of tanks available in the theater of operations at that time. Instead, the Army's 713th Tank Battalion was converted into a provisional flamethrower battalion for the Okinawa operation, with 54 M4 medium tanks equipped with H1 flamethrower tanks. The magnitude of this construction initiative required organizing a flamethrower group at Schofield Barracks, Oahu, integrated by Navy Seabees and Army personnel. The first converted tanks were delivered on Christmas Day 1944 and the last on January 22, 1945. Following experiences in Iwo Jima with fire hoses, the battalion was provided with 3 sets of standard 122 meters and 3.8 centimeters rubber hoses to attack caves too remote for direct tank attack. In addition to converting the 713th Armored Flamethrower Tank Battalion in late November, the Fleet Marine Force requested 54 flamethrower tanks, 9 for each of the 6 divisions, and the Army's 27th Infantry Division requested conversion of 12 light tanks into Satan tanks. Due to lack of resources, it was decided that the 713th Tank Battalion would be used to support Army and Marine units in the upcoming Okinawa operation. Other units would have to make do with available supplies of auxiliary flamethrowers. The 10th Army wanted to provide periscope flamethrowers at a scale of 1 to 2 per tank platoon, but Washington informed them that the E6R1 would not be available in time. As a result, they were provided with the POA-CWS type. These were used to equip the 193rd and 711th Tank Battalions in Oahu in December 1944 at a scale of 18 per battalion. Additional batches were delivered to other units destined for Okinawa, including the 706th and 763rd Tank Battalions in Leyte and the 710th Tank Battalion in New Caledonia. The 713th AFT Tank Battalion entered combat for the first time on April 19, 1945. The terrain in Okinawa was considerably different from that of Iwo Jima volcano. Most of the fighting took place in southern Okinawa, which consisted of cultivated valleys dominated by high coral ridges. Most of the island was covered with thick vegetation, and the Imperial Japanese Army built extensive defensive works in the hills, in addition to using traditional crypts that dotted the hills near villages. As a result, Much of the fighting was waged against heavily fortified ridge defense lines. The usual tactic consisted of assigning a company of 18 flamethrower tanks to an army or marine tank battalion, which in turn divided the flamethrower tanks into platoons of 6 flamethrower tanks per company. Normally, a reinforced tank company was assigned to an infantry regiment for key attacks. The Marines developed tactics called corkscrew and blowtorch to dismantle Japanese defenses. Each defense line was systematically processed using tanks protected by riflemen. Tanks began by suppressing Japanese bunkers with direct fire and then opened fortified defenses with tank guns before being attacked by flamethrower tanks. The objective was to clear an area of about 450 meters deep before moving to the next zone where the process was repeated. Flamethrowers proved very effective at expelling Japanese defenders from fortifications and trenches where they were vulnerable to infantry, tank, and artillery fire. The Army's 24th Corps reported that success against Japanese defense lines depended on close collaboration between infantry and tank assault teams, infantry demolition assault teams, and infantry and flamethrower assault teams. When attacking caves on steep cliffs, fire hose extensions were used with considerable success. Fighting in mid-May 1945 focused on heights north of Shuri. The Japanese 32nd Army headquarters was located under Shuri Castle. During this fighting, the 713th AFT Tank Battalion was divided into separate companies. Company A supported the 7th Division, Company B the 1st Marine Division, and Company C the 77th Division. During May 1945, the battalion burned 190,000 liters of fuel in their flamethrower attacks. Fighting continued towards southern Okinawa in the 3rd week of June, when the last organized Japanese defenses were overcome. During the Battle of Okinawa, the 713th AFT Battalion suffered 7 casualties and 112 wounded or missing. In comparison, it was credited with killing about 4,800 Japanese soldiers. A total of 630 flamethrower sorties were carried out, consuming 199,950 gallons of fuel, primarily 6% napalm-thickened fuel. Of the battalion's 54 flamethrower tanks, 41 were disabled during combat, of which 26 were repaired and 15 were lost beyond repair. The most common cause of tank losses were anti-tank guns and mines, 8 of each. One tank was lost at the beginning of the campaign by falling into a shell hole during landing and had to be written off due to salt water damage. In addition to the 713th AFT Tank Battalion, most Army and Marine tank battalions had a variable number of auxiliary flamethrowers, including the E4R2-5R1 bowgun mount and periscope flamethrowers. The 763rd Tank Battalion used an auxiliary flamethrower on one occasion without much effect. The 711th Tank Battalion had periscope flamethrowers, but after 2 incidents, the battalion removed the auxiliary flamethrowers. In one of them, a tank was hit by Japanese artillery and a flamethrower unit exploded, killing 3 crew members and wounding the other 2. Another tank ran over a mine and the fuel unit exploded. News of these incidents spread among Army tank battalions. A subsequent report indicated that Army tank units considered that the auxiliary flame tank's range was too short, fuel capacity too small, and they were concerned due to increased fire risk. After the campaign, the Army's 24th Corps ordered removal of auxiliary flamethrowers and that main armament flamethrowers be converted to the standard type. The valuable contribution of the 713th AFT Tank Battalion was praised by all. A group of Army observers reported that the general opinion of the user weapon is that the armored flamethrower is an extremely valuable weapon, as it can kill the enemy or force him to abandon positions that no other weapon can reach. It is a great morale booster for our infantry. This was demonstrated on numerous occasions as our infantry advanced with the flamethrower tank, but not with standard tanks. The 17th Infantry, 7th Division, reported that flamethrower tanks were invaluable against enemies entrenched in coral formations, thick brush and caves, expelling them from these positions when all other means had failed. In some cases, flamethrower tanks were the only weapons that could expel the enemy from their positions. The 7th Division reported that flamethrower tanks had extraordinary success and were of utmost importance, and recommended that, in the future, one company of each tank battalion attached to infantry divisions be equipped with flamethrower tanks. The lessons of the Okinawa operation reaffirmed the value of flamethrower tanks against new Japanese defensive tactics. Technically, many tankers considered that the short range and limited capacity of auxiliary flamethrowers did not justify the danger of fuel storage. The H-1 flamethrower tank, with high capacity and long range, was preferred, although crews argued it would be even better if it could be mounted coaxially with a 75mm gun, allowing the tank to use either weapon depending on circumstances.